Welcome everyone to the April 2023 meeting of the Humanist Society of Santa Barbara. My name is Judy Flattery. I'm the president of the society. HSSB is a 501c3 nonprofit, 100% volunteer run, founded in the mid-90s with about 120 members. We feature monthly educational speakers. We have a monthly newsletter, which is available via email and on our website free of charge. And our public events are posted on our Humanist Society of Santa Barbara meetup site, as well as on the meetup site of the Southern California Secular Coalition. And our speaker today is Dave Flattery. And we'll be talking today about a subject called the State of the World Scorecard. Are we getting better? Are we getting worse? Or is it too close to call? The State of the World Scorecard looks at trends of some key metrics in the areas of social development, political freedom, economic prosperity, and environmental sustainability. For the past 4 years, Dave has been leading an international team that was established over 15 years ago to develop a global scorecard of outcomes in these areas. The team works to find and report measures from credible data sources, so that people who have an intention, a commitment, or a project for positively impacting some specific aspect of the world can see whether their work is having a statistically significant impact in a specific country or on the global metrics. The metrics are consistent with humanist values, and in addition to the scorecard, he'll explore some topics on the practice of measurement, how averaged or aggregated data can hide key information, how to find bright spots and outliers that can provide insight, and some context for the topic of looking at a few metrics in more detail across the world and over much longer timescales than the 20-year history of the scorecard. Dave is the strategic initiatives leader for one of the business units of the DuPont company. He's certified Six Sigma Master Black Belt and has both taught and used methods to extract understanding from data through the application of statistical analysis. He leads the scorecard team. The scorecard team was founded by the Academy of Landmark Education, which identifies, tracks, and reports this core set of metrics to validate how are we trending relative to a sustainable world of peace, freedom, and sufficiency for all. And in addition to being our treasurer, he also serves on the board of the United Way of Santa Barbara. So with that, Dave, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you for putting this together for us.
Sure, thanks. So yeah, I'm going to be going over the State of the World Scorecard, giving an overview of it, and as was stated in the introduction, some other topics of measurement. And I hope at the end, the title, is it getting better or worse, or is it too close to call? It'll be clear that attempting to answer a simplistic question like that is really not useful, and that things are much more nuanced and complicated than that. Another way to look at this is what kind of insight and power or access to be able to change things can we get from measurement. What I'll go over is some background on the scorecard, how it came to be, and what its purpose is in Landmark Education, the institution that instituted this. Do a little quick comparison of how some of the measures relate to humanism, particularly the humanist affirmations, some comparison to the Sustainable Development Goals and where they overlap. And then a tour through the metrics of the scorecard. There are 21 metrics that we track in 4 areas. And along the way, stop for some deeper dives into a few of the metrics. Many of the metrics are indices, so they're not just a single number like CO2 per capita, just a single number. Many of them are indices, political rights, civil liberties, gender equity, things like that, that are composed of a lot of individual measurements. So I'll go quickly through what the components of those indices are to give a little bit more understanding of what makes up the Environmental Performance Index or the ecological footprint. And then a few other topics on measurement, looking at aggregation and averages versus drilling down more into the data and how the picture can be very different. Intersections and outliers, we look at relationships between different metrics, looking for global bright spots. So bright spots in terms of across the globe, but also across all measures. Where is their performance that's displaced from everybody else that could be useful to explore? And then zoom out a little bit in time. The scorecard is 20 years, which is a very brief period, even thinking about the modern age, let alone the history of people or the earth. So looking out a little bit at some metrics over time to put them in a little bit more context of what's changing and how fast, and then wrap up a little bit. So the background, as Judy mentioned, the scorecard has been prepared annually for about the last 17 years now for a forum called the Conference for Global Transformation that's held each May since 2000. It's a conference for people with projects and commitments aligned with a vision of a world that works for everybody with nobody and nothing left out. And grown out of, for the most part, their participation in programs from Landmark Education, the institution that sponsors that. And several of those programs invite people to create and fulfill a promise or a commitment for the world. And the original thesis of the scorecard is to look at what things we could measure at the global level that we might expect to change if this is working, if those promises are being fulfilled. So, global transformation, what is that all about? So one of the premises is that the source of breakthroughs in the lives of people, it makes a difference in the lives of everybody else, is taking a stand or a commitment for others. So this thing, the way it's defined, transformation, is discontinuous and not really measurable. So we work to say what change, what phenomena would be emergent from this if the collective impact of this was actually making a difference in the world. So that's the intention of the scorecard. We work pretty hard to try and select data that is collected consistently over time by credible sources and, as I mentioned, in a consistent manner that measures outcomes. So we've worked to focus the metrics. There's some that we retired and replaced on the outcomes. So not necessarily a particular hypothesis about what we ought to be doing in order to make things better, but the outcome that are things improving? Are people more prosperous, less poor, less hungry, living longer, things like that, rather than, well, we should improve the gas mileage of cars. So those are the kinds of metrics that we look for and endeavor to publish in the scorecard. In a lot of these, you'll see, I'll put good in quotes or bad in quotes, the direction that things are changing. The desired or intended direction of the metrics change is what's set by the institution producing the metric. And that's what we'll refer to as the good direction, or it's improving or getting better. And then I always like this Margaret Mead quote, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. It's one of the premises of the whole work of this is that it will only be accomplished by individuals taking on commitments to make improvements. All right, so how do all these measures that we have, and I know I haven't gone through what the measures are yet, but some of them are on here. How do they align with humanist principles? And these are the affirmations of humanism. It was published by Paul Kurtz. The first one being committed to the application of reason and science to the understanding of the universe. Well, I mean, that's why we measure. That's what we endeavor to do with these measurements, is to apply objective, thoughtful measurement to human problems to enable folks to work on them and see how they're doing. We believe in an open, pluralistic society. Democracy is the best guarantee of protecting human rights. And one of the metrics in the scorecard is political rights. Cultivate negotiation and compromise. One of the metrics is a peace index that looks at conflict and violence in countries and around the world. Concern with securing justice and fairness, eliminating discrimination. That's a civil liberties index, as well as there's a gender gap, specific gender gap index is one of the metrics. Similarly, for the next affirmation regarding loyalties based on race and religion and nationality, civil liberties and gender gap. Protecting and enhancing the earth. 6 of the 21 metrics are environmental metrics. We believe in the cultivation of moral excellence. One I think that's most specifically targeted to this is the corruption perceptions index that looks at the level of corruption in societies. This next one has a lot of pieces to it around health and being able to express yourself and have access to fulfilling your aspirations, Child mortality is one thing we measure, as well as the Human Development Index from the UN. And we believe that the fullest realization of the best and noblest that we are capable of as human beings. And there's a bunch of those that intersect with that. The happiness index in terms of self-reported subjective well-being, that is the backbone of the happiness index. The giving index in terms of giving money or time to others. Level of poverty that can inhibit one from becoming the best they can be as human beings. And the Human Development Index. So in my perspective, the underlying principles of what measures are selected are very much consistent with humanist principles in general. And similarly, they align up pretty well with the Sustainable Development Goals. We often debate on the scorecard team, well, do we need to come up with our own metrics? Why don't we just use the Human Development Goals? There's a consensus at the UN that these are the things we should be working on. And there is a lot of overlap between them. These are the 16 Sustainable Development Goals, and if colored in completely, it's one of the metrics. If it's covered in partially, the Sustainable Development Goal is a component of one of those indices, and if it's empty, then it's not reflected in the scorecard. So, for example, hunger. We don't have a direct measure of hunger. The UN also struggles to come up with a global direct measure of hunger. Some institutions that work on hunger use child mortality as a proxy for hunger because it's measurable and it's an outcome of sufficiency that number goes down. So there's challenges that we've had in actually finding and tracking and over time measures that directly measure all the Sustainable Development Goals. And also this graph is the fraction missing of the raw country data. And so, of course, for recent years, it's very high. A lot of these data will lag the time it is now by a couple of years before you get data on these. But even for longer periods, about half the data are missing. So it's challenging. But one of the things I'll say repeatedly is that the landscape of data available to everybody is changing really, really fast. I mean, just even over the period of time I've been working on the scorecard, it's hugely different in terms of being able to get detailed data on a number of things that institutions measure about the world. So that will likely improve and we'll continue looking at that. But I think the message about the Sustainable Development Goals is that they're well aligned with both the humanist principles as well as the scorecard metrics. And the way they're explicitly defined, there's some challenges in really getting close to real-time complete data on some of them. So what do the overall global trends look like for the last 22 years? So the period of time we're looking at, you'll see defined in some of the later graphs as the scorecard era, is just this century, 2000 to 2022, because 2023 isn't done yet, so we don't know how that turned out. But overall, the four domains that we look at, economic, environmental, social, and political, green means that as defined by the gathering institution, the metrics are improving. And all of the economic metrics, even globally inequality, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail, has improved over these 20 years. Environmental, with one exception that you'll see, have all been declining. One of them is due more to the institution collecting it than the actual performance. We can't see a statistically significant change, but in total, the environmental measures have been declining. Social measures have been improving over the period, some pretty dramatically. Political measures are a little bit mixed. Overall, they're more declining than improving, and that's particularly true recently. Many of the political measures have deteriorated more recently than they had in the period of 10 years ago, for example. So each of the metrics is going to be shown on a graph that looks like this. This one happens to be GDP per capita per day. We show the data for the world, as well as the three most populous countries, which are China, India, and the US. Those three countries comprise about 40% of the global population. Another thing we debate, how many lines to put on the graph before it becomes less useful because there's too much information on it. So right now, this is the format. The arrow on the ordinate label shows the desired direction of the metric. And that's one thing to keep in mind. Some of these metrics, their direction is not intuitive. So the number goes up and it's getting worse. May not be the intended direction. Many of them, it's obvious, like percent living in poverty, you want that to go down, so that arrow's down. But some of these, like political rights and civil liberties indices, it's less obvious. But there will always be an arrow on the ordinate that shows which is the intended direction of the metric. There'll be a number in the middle of the graph on the percent change per year as estimated by least squares regression against time. If the change in the global metric isn't significant, the border will be gray, which means there's been no statistically significant trend over the period of the scorecard. If there is a significant trend, the border will either be red or green, depending on if it's going in the intended direction, it'll be green. If it's not in the intended direction, it'll be red. And if the average rate of change estimated that way is greater than 1.1%, which was chosen because it was the rate of population growth a couple of years ago. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but that's currently the cutoff between having a single colored border or a double colored border. So if things are changing with an absolute value of less than 1.1% per year, they get a single border, and more than that, they get a double border. Most of the things are either they're changing 3 or 4% a year, or they're changing a fraction of a percent a year. But there are a couple that are near that cutoff point. But the double border means the change is rapid based on that definition. We always cite the organization as the source of the data behind the graph, on the graph. And in the global metric, in the legend, there's a parenthetical number, which is the number of countries that comprise the global number. So for some of them, it's very, very many countries. A lot of the World Bank data endeavors to get numbers for every single country. Some of the other ones, the Freedom on the Net, for example, has a smaller sample of the countries, 80 or so. That number represents how many countries comprise that global metric. So getting into the measures. So these are the 3 economic measures we take. First one is GDP per person per day in the U.S. The number is cited in U.S. dollars, but these numbers are for the world and the countries I mentioned. So the global change has been increasing by 3.5% a year. It's one of the higher percent changes you'll see in any of these metrics. And you can see a little bit of what we infer to be the pandemic influence, in that there was contraction globally and in most countries in GDP between 2019 and 2020. That has largely recovered in 2022. But overall, the trend of this aggregated average number, which we'll talk about a lot in the next couple of graphs, has been going up steadily and healthily. The next one is percentage living in poverty, and I'll have a few more graphs to talk about this as well. And that has been going down quite dramatically globally, certainly for the last 20 years and really for longer than that. And you can see, for example, in China, the red line has gone from over 60% of their population, which is a lot of people living with a reference. And again, I'll talk more about this in the next couple graphs, a reference poverty threshold of $3.65 a day, 60-some% of their people to being less than 5 now, which has really been a remarkable change for more than 1 billion people. Similarly, but kind of lagging, is India, coming down from a very high level of poverty, and you'll see more there. The next metric is the Gini coefficient, which is a measure of how inequitable the distribution of wealth is amongst the population of a country. And overall, and this is one that may not be obvious, but when the Gini index is lower, then things are distributed more equitably. So the intended direction, the Gini index, is down. And you can see that overall, over the period, the global Gini index has decreased. It really hasn't changed for the last 10 years. But if you look at it over 20 years, it still has a significant downward trend. But for all 3 of the countries that we look at, the Gini index has risen over that period fairly healthily. And again, I will go in a lot more detail with Gini coefficient in the next few. So overall, economics are improving. The world is getting richer. That wealth is being distributed very, very slightly more equitably than it had in the past when you look at it globally. Again, we'll talk more about that. And the thing I think that really is clear is that by objective measures at the bottom, where people are really in poverty, and particularly people who are in extreme poverty, there have been quite substantial improvements in pulling people out of that kind of level of extreme poverty. So, speaking of poverty, on these graphs, we have 3 different thresholds for poverty. So the World Bank defines 3 thresholds for poverty based on the poverty levels in lower income countries as a group, lower middle income countries as a group, and middle income countries as a group. And those levels based on constant 2017 purchasing power parity dollars are shown in that first blue graph for the world, 215, 365, and 685. So this is a frequent source of debate amongst the team that works on this scorecard. Is these numbers seem really low. We're just showing people going from ultra poor to super poor. I think it's a little more complex than that, and it is really challenging to define poverty globally. And the World Bank does it by setting these three benchmarks, recognizing that to get out of poverty in a lower income country may require fewer resources than to get out of poverty in a high income country. And that's why they have multiple levels. They adjust these between countries when they're looking at percentages based on the cost of living in terms of food and shelter, transportation, as well as inflation over time. So that when we make comparisons over time and we compare one country to another, to the extent they can, the numbers are comparable amongst countries, but it's very challenging, it's very complicated. But given all those complications, the way that things have worked out based on the World Bank numbers, these are all World Bank numbers, the percent of the population experiencing poverty globally, when you look at all three of these benchmarks, 215, 365, 685, has declined over this period. The number we choose to report on is the middle one, 365 a day. That's largely because the data for the 685 day are a lot thinner. It's not as broadly reported in all countries. So we choose the highest level for which there's really what we think is sufficient data. But you can see that it's declined over the period against all three of those benchmarks globally. And you can see that as it's declined, it's still 25% of the world's population is at or below the $3.65 a day level. So whether you think the poverty level should be higher, that's a lot of people. It's close to 2 billion people. And we'll talk about that on the next slide. The U.S. is the next one. You can see it's low, and we can't really see what the trend is. I'll blow it up in a second. So the World Bank also defines and reports on regions. The two regions that are most impoverished are South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. And if you look at those regions, there also are declines. And again, not similar to the global one. There's a big decline in the lower income country threshold of 215 a day in both South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Certainly much more progress in South Asia, but all those levels have declined as a percent of the population. In the U.S., if we blow this up, so these are all on the same scale, which I try to do so we're not doing graph engineering to changes the message. But if we blow the U.S. up, you can see that our numbers are low and they're pretty flat. So there hasn't been a big decrease in the number of people below these thresholds or above these thresholds. It's been low but flat. So if we represent the data in a little bit different way, and instead of looking at the percent of the population that is experiencing poverty, we look at the number of people experiencing poverty versus the benchmark, it's really quite a different appearance to the graphs. So in all the regions, the population at the higher level, the 685 a day level, has increased over the last 40 years. All four of the regions here, not in every country in the world, but the four regions that we're looking at here. That proportion has gone up across the board in terms of the number of people living at or below that threshold. For the lower threshold, certainly in the impoverished regions, there's been slight to significant decreases in the total number of people in South Asia and around the world. But in the US and in Sub-Saharan Africa, the numbers for each of the thresholds has been increased. So there's a question in the chat about what's considered the poverty level in the US. 685 a day. The poverty level in the U.S. would not be 685 a day. It would be 685 a day in terms of these numbers translated for the cost of living in the U.S. So what's the cost of food and housing and transportation in the U.S.? I think in general, it's, if I'm remembering right, something under $20,000 a year is the poverty level that the U.S. cites when the U.S. measures poverty. So one of the messages for this one, and really for all these graphs, are to keep in mind that when the graphs are green, it just means it's improving. It doesn't necessarily mean it's good. I don't know that many people would think that 2 billion people in the world living in poverty is good, but it's going down, is the message of green. Okay, this is going to get just a little mathematical on this chart. I apologize, but the Gini coefficient is kind of useful, I think, to understand what the Gini coefficient is. Sometimes you'll also hear Gini index. It's a measure in the degree of inequality of the distribution of a resource across a population. And the way we represent that distribution is with something called a Lorentz curve, which at each point you can go out on the x-axis to a percent of the population. And if you go up to where that curve is, on the y-axis is the share of the resource that is allocated to the lowest X percent of the population. So if you go out 10%, you go up to the curve and it says 1%, that means 1% of the resources are allocated to the lowest 10% of the population, the 10% of the population with the least amount of resources. So it's ordered in that as the percentage of the population is going up, each increment's share of resources is going up. So it's sorted and ordered that way. And so you get a curve, like the made up one drawn there, the red curve. And if everything was equal, if everybody had exactly the same income or exactly the same wealth, the Lorentz curve would be a straight line between 0, 0 and 1, 1. So each time we added a fraction of the population along the x-axis, we'd add the same amount of income or wealth to the y value, and we'd add that straight line. But we don't get that. We don't get anywhere near that anyplace. And so the actual distributions are these concave upward curves. Because it's sorted, they're always concave upward. And the area between that curve that's marked with the A and the equal distribution line is that area relative to the triangle under the distribution line is the Gini coefficient. So, and just because of the way the math works, it's 2 times the area of that difference between the equal distribution and the actual distribution drawn as a Lorentz curve. So if everything is completely equal, which is never anywhere near that, but if it were to be, the Gini index would be 0. And if it was completely unequal, and if one person had all the wealth in the country, the Gini index would get very, very close to 1. So when Gini index is close to 1, it's a very inequitable distribution. When it's close to 0, when it's close to 0.3, it's an extremely equitable distribution in terms of really sustainable distributions. Some examples. It's a useful concept to dig in a little bit more. So we get most of the inequality data that we use for the scorecard from the World Inequality Database. That's a coalition of universities globally, centered in Europe, but there's US and Asian institutions that participate in that because it's mathematically a little bit complicated and data intense to get sufficiently granular data on pre- and post-tax income as well as wealth to be able to actually calculate a good estimate of the Gini coefficient. In this case, I've drawn sort of simplified Lorentz curves by just looking at the lowest 50% of the population, the next 40%, so that goes up to the 90th percentile, the next 9% that goes up to the 99th percentile, and the final 1% that gets up to 100% of the population. And what share of the wealth or income, and in this case it's wealth, is allocated in that country, in this case, to each of those slices of the population. So there are 3 countries on here, the U.S. Most of the things I do, I'll show the U.S. since we're largely U.S.-based, and then some global examples. And in this case, it's the Netherlands, which in the most recent report from the Inequality Database had the lowest Gini index, so the most equitable distribution of wealth in the world, and South Africa, which had the least equitable, the highest Gini index. And then these Lorentz curves, the orange, the blue, and the green, show how those are actually at those percentiles, how those chords of the Lorentz curve look. And so visually you can see that as things get less equitably distributed, the curve gets kind of pushed into that corner as the share of wealth that goes to the last few percentiles of the population increases. That area between the curve and the line of equality grows, and so the Gini index grows. So to make it a little bit more tangible and less graphical, I put together this example where if you thought about a population of 100 people and you had $10,000 of wealth to distribute, and you distributed it in the same way as it's distributed in the curves for these 3 countries, what would that look like? So if you distributed it the way the U.S. is distributed, the poorest 50 people would each get $3 out of the 10,000. The next 40 people would get $70. The 9 people that weren't the top person would get $400 each. And then the 1%, the one person at the end would get $3,500. One of the metrics that is looked at is the ratio between the bottom 50%, the share that it's not really the median, but the interval up to the median, that share versus the 1% share. So in this case, that ratio in the U.S. is about 1,000. For the Netherlands, the poorest 50 people would get about $18 of wealth, so that's 6 times as much as the 50% of the population in the U.S. And then it goes up to 100 and 350. And the 1% is 1,600, which is about half what it is in the US. And so that ratio is only about 90. You can see there's a very big difference in the ratio. It's a very big difference kind of just looking at the numbers. The difference in the Gini coefficient is from 0.64 for the Netherlands to 0.83 for the US. So to kind of scale the differences may be that you look at 0.64 and 0.83 and say, well, it isn't really all that different. It's 0.2 more, not quite, but it really is quite a dramatic difference when you look at the equitability of the distribution. Still pretty inequitable. For the bottom 50, it's 6 times as generous. And then you look at South Africa, which has the highest Gini index of the countries, so the most inequitable distribution. Each of those poorest 50 people actually owe you $5. So the net wealth of the bottom 50% of the population in South Africa is negative. So it's one of the few countries where that's true. My own inference is that it's an artifact of the social structures they had 40 years ago that are still causing effects today. But at any rate, the bottom 50% of the population in South Africa is in debt in total net. The middle 40 people get $40 each. So even up to the 90th percentile with the same amount of wealth to distribute, it is lower than in either the US or in the Netherlands. Next 9 get $340. Even in the 90th to 99th percentile, it's a lower share than in the US or the Netherlands. And then the 1% is $5,500. So more than half of the wealth is owned by about 1% of the population. And we can't really do a ratio because the 50% is negative, but as I said, it's the most unequal distribution there. So a couple things that also may not be obvious, but point to useful things for the graph. So for this example, it's important to note, not in the actual graph of the countries, but in this example with these hugely different distributions, the per capita wealth in all the countries is exactly the same. So it's something to keep in mind when you look at per capita GDP and say, oh, well, their per capita GDP is pretty high. That's true, but it's a very incomplete picture of the total prosperity of the economy to look at it at simply a per capita number. Because here are examples based on real distributions where there's a really pretty enormous difference in the prosperity of big chunks of the economy, and they all have the same per capita wealth. So in real life, is it like that? And it's actually not too far off. In reality, the per capita wealth is similar in all 3 countries within about 20%. None of these are very poor countries. The per capita wealth ranges from about 350,000 to 500,000. So compared to the global distribution of per capita wealth, these are actually pretty tightly grouped, and they span the range from the lowest Gini index to the highest Gini index. The Gini index is something we just started measuring a couple of years ago because we could not find it published for the world, and gathering the data in sufficient detail from all the countries to be able to assemble a Lorentz curve to make a anywhere near accurate estimate of the Gini index for the world was something we didn't think we could do. But the World Inequality Database has since started publishing that. The World Bank publishes Gini coefficients for countries, but not for the world, for the same reason we believe. One more thing on the Gini index. So this is the US Gini trend over time for wealth and income. And a lot of times you hear things discussed about income inequality, which is important. I just want to make a couple distinctions. One, the distinction between income and wealth inequality. So income inequality is something that is relatively transient. It can be modified by policy with taxes and redistribution of income. And we see that in a lot of places where this inequality is addressed through taxation and redistribution of some of the income. In the US, as you can see on the graph, there's a much, much bigger inequality in wealth than there is in income, as measured by the Gini index, which might be surprising. But the parenthetical example here, that if you think about what's the bigger number, the ratio between Elon Musk's income and my income, or Elon Musk's wealth and my wealth. It's wealth by 2 or 3 orders of magnitude. It's wealth. Wealth is observed to be significantly less equally distributed. It's also much more durable. It's something that transfers across generations, where income doesn't necessarily, and it can lead to structural issues. And the example here, SR Nicholas, it is reported to be much harder to address big inequities in wealth because it is durable and it is much less subject to redistribution if that's what's needed. So we chose to use the Wealth Inequality Index in the scorecard for those reasons. From what we could discern from the research, it was the better proxy for really looking at the health of a society in terms of its prosperity and how equally that was distributed. Okay, on to environmental measures. So we have two measures we do of CO2. We debate this a lot. One is the aggregate emissions of CO2 in trillions of kilograms. We try and make the units more relatable. People maybe don't know what a gigaton is, so we state it in terms of trillions of kilograms. It's double red. It's been going up at 1.8% per year over the period. The U.S. actually in aggregate has been going down. China and India have been going up. China pretty significantly, and globally it's been going up pretty significantly. It did flatten a little bit 2018 to 2019 and went down in 2020. Many attribute that to the pandemic, and it has since bounced back in 21, and we don't have the data for 22 yet. One could say it's kind of leveling off. My analogy for CO2 is that with this graph, we're measuring how fast we're digging. The y-axis on this is that we're in a hole and we would like to be out of the hole. Our ultimate goal is to be out of the hole, but we're digging. And if this graph is going up, we're digging faster each year than we dug last year. So we're not only not making progress to getting out of the hole, we're actually digging. And not only are we digging, we're digging faster than we dug last year. And that's still true now. But the curve does seem to be concave downward a little bit. So the rate at which we're increasing our rate of digging is decreasing. So that's progress in the second derivative of digging. So ultimately, if this is a problem we have to solve, we have to get to the point where not only are we not digging faster, we have to be digging slower. And then ultimately we have to stop digging and then we have to start filling in. So of all the things that seem the farthest from resolution in my looking at things, this one seems very, very hard. We also look at CO2 per capita per year. You can see that's gone down. It's a lot more dramatic than the aggregate CO2, partly because of the Y scale, one of the problems with aggregate graphs. But at any rate, CO2 per capita has been declining in the US, which is good. It's been going up in China and India. And overall for the world, it's been going up a little, but not too much. But we'll show some more on kind of how this relates to other metrics in some later graphs. The third one is renewable energy generation. So this is energy generated from wind, solar, geothermal, biomass, or hydroelectric. And of all the measures that we have in the scorecard, this is the one that's changing the fastest. And it's double green. It's going up by 5.4% a year. Nothing else is going up by more than 3 point something, if I'm remembering them all correctly. And it's going up everywhere. It's going up a lot in China, but China's consumption of energy is also going up, and they're still building coal plants, and they're putting in a lot of renewable energy. So their carbon footprint is going up a lot, but they're also putting up a lot of renewable energy capacity. So that's all about energy and CO2 and kind of climate change environmental topic. There are other environmental topics. Annual forest loss intersects a lot of environmental issues, but certainly is related to CO2, in that is where CO2 is, as of today, right now, captured for the most part, is in forests. So, and annual forest loss has been increasing, continues to increase, and this is another aggregate measure. So the scale on the graph makes it a little bit hard to read exactly what's going on in the US, China, and India, because that's just their share of that total aggregation for the world. But overall, it's going up, and for the most part, it's going up in all three of these countries, although it may be hard to see it in the graph. Ecological footprint is a very interesting measure. I like this measure. If you look at the way a society consumes resources in terms of for its manufacturing, for its feeding itself, for its transportation, and if it needs to offset that carbon with hectares of resources, then how many hectares of the earth does it take for them to sustain that lifestyle? And it can translate that into how many earths. So if everybody lived like people in the US, how many earths would it take? So the y-axis is in hectares, and I'll show some later ones where we translate that into the number of earths to look at sustainability. But this is a pretty comprehensive assessment of the resources consumed country by country for food, industry, shelter, and transportation. And you can see that for the world, it's still going up slowly. This is one of those 0.5% a year ones. It's going up a lot in China. faster than elsewhere, and it's going down in the US, which is the intended direction. But globally, it's still going up. This last one we keep in, even though we have some concerns about some of the reporting. It's reported by Yale on the Environmental Performance Index. It has a lot of components that are connected to things people are working on: biodiversity, the health of fisheries, emissions of things other than CO2. And so it's a performance index that hypothetically would be a very useful metric. In terms of what they've published, there have been some inconsistencies. So we've left it in, but it's really an artifact of those inconsistencies in the publication of the metric that had this be gray, no significant change because of the perturbations in the numbers. I think if they clean those up, this would be red pretty clearly. But just from a raw, those are the numbers. And when we look at them, the noise in the numbers is greater than the trend. So we have to say there's no statistical significant change. But there are 29 important environmental measures. And so far, even though we have some difficulties with it, it's the best one we've seen in terms of an aggregate index for environmental performance. So a couple more graphs that are sideways from everything we've seen so far, which is around measuring conversations. So it's another thing that we've been looking at in terms of what ideas are coming. So Google Ngram is a very interesting database that looks at the prevalence of words and phrases through both the internet as well as written stuff in all of the Google archive of documents, which is enormous, in books. It goes back about 100 years. So you can look at how often were people using the word sustainability 100 years ago. Well, they weren't, but they were using, well, we'll start on the left graph, which is more about education. And this one looks at the frequency of use of formal education versus online learning and classroom learning. The reason I put this one up here is that online learning actually started going up pretty significantly 20 years ago. For a lot of folks, the introduction to it ended up being the pandemic, but it really has been percolating for quite a while. It's one of the reasons we looked at these as potentially leading metrics. But it challenges when we look at several of our indices, the gender gap, the Human Development Index, include educational attainment as one of the components of the index. And right now, they don't account for online learning. So in the future, my expectation is it will be something to figure out is to how do we get a good picture of educational attainment when more and more of the components of that attainment are going to be online and not institutions handing out degrees. The next one looks at changes in activity more centered around manufacturing, I'd say, or production or commercial activity. And you could see that production kind of was the word, and then it became productivity. And really just a lot since 2000, sustainability is becoming the word. And we see this a lot in companies. One of the things we look at is how many companies in their vision or mission statement talk about having sustainability goals. There are a lot of institutions that collect that information. And one thing we're actually looking for is there something that's going to replace sustainability? Is it going to be regenerative or restorative? May ultimately be what comes after sustainability. Moving on to the social measures. First one is child mortality per 1,000 births, so children that die before they reach the age of 5. This is another one kind of like poverty, where if you look at it globally and over long periods of time, there's been a huge amount of progress. From a couple of years ago, it was nearly half, and now even globally, it's down under 40 per 1,000. It's changing at 3.5% a year, another one of the very rapid changes. It is flattening out. It certainly is flattening out. In a lot of the developed world, there seems to be kind of a wall at about 2. We don't really see countries getting under 2, but it's an important metric and one that is very steadily and consistently improving at a pretty high rate. The Human Development Index is published by the UN, and it's widely cited. It's a pretty useful measure that's cited and compared to things. It looks at life expectancy, educational attainment, and income. So it is a relatively simple measure of data that are, for the most part, collected pretty consistently across the world that are intended to reflect sort of when you talk about developing countries and highly developed countries, that is based on the score of this Human Development Index. And it has gone up very steadily up until 2 years ago, and I'll talk more about that on the next slide, but really globally in the last 2 years, there's been a decline, which is the first time that's happened since it started being measured. And then the gender gap, which is an index of 14 measures of gender equity, which includes things, I'll quickly breeze through some of the components of these indices, but earning power, representation in government, representation on company boards and things, how well represented and how equitably participating are women in a society is the gender gap. And you can see that it's improving globally. So overall, it's been a little bit perturbed, perhaps by the pandemic. Certainly, it seems perhaps that happened in India in one direction and maybe in the U.S. in another. I'm not really sure I can explain all this, but it's been bouncing around in the pandemic more than it seems to have in the prior years. But overall, the global trend is still positive. So I mentioned HDI being widely used to cite overall human development and assess overall human development, and I mentioned the components. So in 2020 and in 2021, it declined, and it was the first time since it started being collected in 1990. There is a hypothesis that this is an artifact of the COVID-19 pandemic, and it is plausible, right, that impacts in income, educational attainment, and life expectancy are all pretty well published, that the pandemic impacted those metrics. But if you look at how fast globally things have been going up and how much they went down, it's about a 5-year backslide in the HDI growth because of the declines in the last 2 years, whether they're related to the pandemic or not. It's about a 5-year backslide. 2019 to 2020, 87% of the countries reported were assessed to have a lower Human Development Index. And again, that was the first time that it was lower at all, and it was 87% of the countries. And it was about half the countries in 2020 and 2021. And if you look at the change over the 2 years, so if the country went down in 2020 and then recovered back in 2021, they would be zero or higher in whether or not they declined on that bottom row from 2019 to 2021. Still, 82% of the countries are lower than they were in 2019. So some recovery to do in the HDI index that may be a result of the pandemic. Some more social measures that we track. One is the percent of the population using the internet. That's published by the World Bank pretty well for a lot of countries. You can see that is rocketing up. Oh, I was wrong. That's actually changing faster than renewable energy. The number of people using the internet has changed over 8% a year. And you can see in China, it's been pretty steady. India really recently has started to rocket up. And it's in here because so much of information as well as access to commercial opportunities is all tied to being able to connect to the rest of the world on the internet. That more complete and equitable access to the internet is something we track. This is the World Happiness Report. It's published by the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, which is sponsored by the UN. It relies a lot on self-reports, so like surveys of subjective well-being, life satisfaction, and positive emotion. It's an interesting report. You can see that overall it's been slightly declining to flat. It is significant. It's certainly been declining in the US. It's declined a lot in India for reasons I don't understand exactly, but it has. And it's gone up in China. But globally, it's gone down slightly in these last 15 years of data for that metric. The Giving Index is something published by the Charities Aid Foundation in Britain, and it looks at the contribution of time or money to volunteer or be charitable as a measure of outward helping of others. It's gone up, continues to go up. In the U.S., looks like it went up a lot, 2020 to 2021 after going down 2019 to 2020. Again, don't know if I understand that, but have a suspicion some of this is disruptions because of the pandemic. Similarly, in India, it went up a lot, and then now it's gone down. So, but overall for the world, it seems to be continuing to go up, which means increased amount of money and time being given to benefit others. So another stop on the tour of the scorecard, some correlations across countries. The first three on the top are statistically significant correlations of the reports of happiness for three other metrics. One is GDP per capita. So as countries become more wealthy, and again, remember all the aggregation that occurs in making a per capita GDP estimate. But as GDP per capita increases, increased happiness is associated with that. Again, these are just correlations. So we observe an association between these two numbers. It's not a cause and effect, one causing the other, that we can infer from these correlations, but they are seen to change together. The education index of the HDI also is strongly correlated with increased happiness. And the last one, which isn't in the scorecard, but Pew Research does a religiosity data collection and report, and that's actually negatively correlated. So higher levels of religiosity are correlated with less happiness in a society. So whether that's, and again, there's no cause and effect, whether that is that in less happy societies, people are more likely to turn to religion, or that high religiosity somehow leads to less happiness, don't know. But there is a significant correlation between religiosity and happiness, and it's a negative correlation. A couple things that were surprising that didn't correlate: components of the peace index, suicide and homicide rates. There is no significant correlation between that and happiness, surprisingly. On to political measures. So these first three, one is the Global Peace Index, which is a measure of internal and external peace, so conflict, criminality, violence within a society, and as well as military kinds of violence externally. That has been getting less peaceful over the last 20 years. If you look at it over a longer period of time, it's not quite the same, but certainly over these last 20 years, it has been getting less peaceful, and that's true for both the US and India. It's not true for China. China actually has been getting a little bit more peaceful than it was around the turn of this century. The second one is the death penalty abolished, and this is a trickier one to measure. We really would think that it may be better just to measure the number of executions, but China considers that a state secret. So there is not access, and they are the world's leading executioner based on Amnesty International's estimates. So we just don't have access to data around the number of executions, and are they going up or are they going down. So as an alternative, we look at for what fraction of the population is the death penalty abolished. So what fraction of the population is not subject to execution by their government. And right now that's just a little bit over 20%. So about 20% of the world's population is not subject to the death penalty. And it's been going up by about 1.6% a year on average. In the last 10 years, it's been pretty flat. Growth rate is a lot lower than that. The other interesting thing about this one is if you look at the three most populous countries, so that 40% of the global population, everybody that lives in those countries is potentially vulnerable to being executed by their government. It's legal for their government to execute them. But for a lot of the rest of the world, the trend has been to move away from the death penalty and abolish it. Freedom on the net is something that is also a relatively new measure. We have data from, I think, 2009. That's published by an organization called Freedom House. They also publish what you'll see on the next slide, the political rights and civil liberties indices. These are measures of how much the government is controlling access, shutting it down, imposing consequences for internet activity, all those kinds of things. And that has been declining globally and really in all the countries on here. Freedom on the net has been declining over this period since it started being measured. And it's certainly a trend of more attempts by the government to influence, if not control, what happens on the internet. And as you can see, particularly in China, which has a very low net freedom score. The last three political measures are political rights, and you see this is pretty discrete. They publish these, both political rights and civil liberties that are both published by Freedom House, are just at discrete levels of 1 to 7. So they don't publish anything in between, so nobody's 1.5, you're either 1 or a 2 or a 7. But you can see that overall, averaged over all the countries, the assessment of both political rights as well as civil liberties over these last 20 years has declined. So there is less political freedom and fewer civil liberties overall. It's changing slowly, right? 0.2, 0.4% a year. You can see the US in 2016 took a step back in political freedom, and we've been at that 2 level, the same as India since then. 2019 to 2020 around civil liberties. Again, this is something that has been hypothesized to be related to the pandemic. You can see that both the world as well as the US and India took a step back in civil liberties at that period. Then the last one is corruption perceptions, and also not such a great one for the US. For the world overall is being assessed as becoming slightly less corrupt year over year. So over the periods, about 0.3% per year improvement, in this case in the corruption perception index. The US has been pretty significantly declining in terms of the corruption index over the same 20 years. China and India are getting better. Still less corrupt than average and getting worse. One other view while we're on political rights, this is a similar index published by the Economist Intelligence Unit that it publishes called the Democracy Index, which is a combination of really both political rights and civil liberties, looking at the electoral process, civil liberties, government functioning, participation in culture, politics, things like that. And I represented this as sorted by rank in terms of democracy index from the worst authoritarian regime, worst being the lowest democracy index score, which happens to be North Korea, PRK there, and then looked at cumulatively how much of the population does that represent of the world. So you can see that in the authoritarian regime score range, it's just a little under 3 billion people. And in the hybrid regime, which is a little bit hard to describe, hard to even interpret from the description that The Economist gives, but it has some appearances of democracy and is underlying an authoritarian regime. That's another 1.2 billion people. So it's just around a bit more than half of the world's population that lives in what we consider non-democratic regimes by this measure. Flawed democracy, about 3.2 billion. That's the single biggest category. It's the category the U.S. has moved into relatively recently, as well as other places in Europe and South America and some in Africa. And so countries all over the place that are in this flawed democracy regime, including India. So it's got 2 of the 3 most populous countries in the U.S. in here, and it's the biggest single category in terms of people. And then what they describe as a full democracy is about 0.6 billion people. So less than 10% of the population is really in a full democracy. And these are 2020 data. It's interesting to look at these metrics, particularly plotted against population. So, if you see that there are 10 Scandinavian countries that all have great scores on stuff, which they mostly do, what a small impact that really has on how many people are suffering from oppression by their governments. Okay, I won't spend a lot of time on this, components of these indices. One of the things we do for the conference is we survey participants about what they're working on and do they have any ideas of things that we ought to be measuring for the scorecard. And many of them are just way too specific. If somebody's working on the recovery of the fisheries in the North Atlantic, we can't really have a North Atlantic fisheries health chart in the scorecard. But fishery health globally is one of the components of the Environmental Performance Index, for example. So many of these, and these aren't all of them that are indices, but these are I think the more important ones. Human development I talked about. Gender gap is an important one and looks at health, education, positions of power in government, as well as compensation and wages, and how equitable is that by gender. Political rights looks at elections, political pluralism, or multi-parties tolerated or suppressed. Does government function? Civil liberties, a bunch of different measures of freedom of expression, including religious freedom, political freedom, freedom of association. Is the rule of law actually applied in the country, or is it capricious as it is in some places? And then as an individual, do you have the right to move around, own a business, associate with who you want, things like that. Freedom on the net is all the things you might expect. Do I have access? Can the government block me? Can the government block me from content it doesn't like? Does it monitor me, invade my privacy, or subject me to consequences for what I'm doing on the internet? The Global Peace Index, as I mentioned, looks at both internal and external peace, criminality and other elements of violence within a society, and how many people die from internal conflicts like civil wars. And then external peace, how much of the resources are spent on military activities? Do they export weapons? How many of their population die in external conflicts? Things like that. And then a couple environmental ones, the ecological footprint. I think I went over this pretty much. It's the net footprint translated into hectares of the Earth's surface for producing food, shelter, transportation, and industry. And then net of trade. So if we import a lot of stuff, it consumes a lot of resources from some other country, that is accounted for in the importing country's footprint. And then this is the Environmental Performance Index that we begrudgingly keep on because it has so many valuable components: CO2, greenhouse gases, nitrous oxide, fluorinated gases, other typical NOx and SO2 pollutants, looking at agriculture and nitrogen management, water resources, typical air quality measures. Water, is there enough water? Everybody have access to sanitation and water? Heavy metals, And then biodiversity, one of the few indices that includes biodiversity numbers, both in terms of species as well as habitat protection, tree cover, and then fisheries. All right, so that's the tour of the scorecard with some stops. Go on to a couple other topics in measurement in general. And one we've kind of touched on already with the discussion about per capita wealth. The scorecard necessarily, since we're trying to show in a few sheets of paper what's going on in the world, it's necessarily a very aggregated view. But there's really much more powerful access available to understanding what's going on by looking more deeply in the data, that there are insights that are going to be obscured by the aggregation. So picking as an example education, this graph is the HDI index for educational attainment. And you can see it's going up. It's going up for the world. It's going up for all three of these countries. And the U.S. has the highest score on the graph. You could accurately conclude that the U.S. is doing well overall. It's the highest line on the graph, and you want it to be up. But if we look a little deeper, it might be a little more complicated than that. So this is a graph, and unfortunately, the U.S. Census doesn't report exactly the same way on educational attainment that the UN reports in the HDI. So this is a slightly different measure, but it still is a measure in the same principle of educational attainment, in that it's the percent of people who have no post-secondary education in a state. And you can see that that varies a lot between the states, from over 60% of the people do have it to 50% or less of the people have it. And the place that actually has the highest degree of population that has post-secondary education is the District of Columbia. So you'd say, okay, they're the best place on the graph. They're probably doing pretty well. When you look at the District of Columbia by zip code, it's got a bigger range in terms of educational attainment than there is between any of the states, ranging from over 50% without post-secondary education to less than 10%. So 90% of the people in some zip codes have post-secondary education. So this isn't really necessarily about education or DC or anything. It's like this for pretty much every metric, like we saw with the income inequality, that if we really work at something, drill into it, because looking at it in aggregate is incomplete by definition and may be misleading in some cases, as in this case. Another thing that I introduced a little bit was looking at correlations between metrics. That can be sort of combined with looking for outliers. Outliers can be very interesting and sometimes illuminating. In this case, we're looking at the correlation between the ecological footprint that I mentioned. So how many Earths would it take to support the lifestyle of everybody on Earth live the way that the people in the US do or the people in Ghana do? So these dots are each a country, and they're located at their ecological footprint and their HDI development score. So as you move from left to right, you get from underdeveloped to developed to highly developed countries. And as you move from bottom to top, you get very quickly to I need a whole Earth, to I need 2 Earths, 3 Earths, 4 Earths, 5 Earths if everybody lived this way. And it's clear that the normal way, the way that most countries do it, you consume more than your share of the available resources as you improve your human development, which is not earth-shattering or stunning, but it is interesting that only one country is in the corner of operable space. And that would be where you're consuming less than an Earth's worth of resources, if everybody lived the way you live, and you're in the very high human development quadrant, which is the target for countries to get to, which means you're educated, prosperous, and you're living a long time. And that's Uruguay. Why is it Uruguay? I don't know. I've been to Uruguay. It was very nice, and they seem to have things pretty nice and do it in a fairly sustainable way. So if one was working on sustainability or sustainable development, looking at what Uruguay does may be informative. So it's an outlier. It's an outlier in that it's bucking the trend to some degree. It's an outlier for happiness as well. We make the same plot of ecological footprint versus happiness based on the World Happiness Report. So then there are outliers on the other side too, right? So it can be useful to look at, well, who's not hitting it out of the park in terms of sustainability and development. And you can see in this case on the number of Earths side of the graph is really where the outliers are. And there's a whole bunch of, there's the US and Canada are here. There's a bunch of Middle East, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, Bhutan, Turkmenistan. There's a lot of outliers here. The one that really stands out is Luxembourg, to me at least. It's in the middle of a bunch of countries that are really pretty progressive in terms of sustainability and are not up in this cloud of very high consumption, along with Kuwait, like Luxembourg is. So why is Luxembourg so displaced? And is there something to learn there or something to work on? This is another graph that's a little bit more complicated, but this is looking at trends over time. On the x-axis is the yearly change in HDI basis points. So how much over the period, the last 20 years, has the HDI changed? And has it changed positively, in which case it's in the right side of the graph, or has it gone down, in which case it's on the left side of the graph? The y-axis is the change in footprint. So is the country reducing its footprint or increasing its footprint? So the first observation when we bin all these countries by the change in these two metrics is that 99% of them are going up in HDI. And that's not surprising. UN is behind it and advocates for improvements in HDI, and everybody would like to be a highly developed country. So 99%, really only Libya and Syria, for likely conflict, civil war reasons, have not gone up. But when you look at sustainability, only 40% have decreased their ecological footprint over that same period. And the one that's an outlier down there, ARE, actually is the ISO code for United Arab Emirates. They are changing very rapidly. They made a huge change. Part of it is because they started way off the map bad. But they are, in terms of the reduction in their ecological footprint, they have made significantly more progress than anybody else that's measured by that organization. Now, is there anything to learn from that? How have they managed to almost cut in half their ecological footprint pretty quickly, certainly much faster than other places? One other thing that we look for, so Uruguay in context of HDI and ecological footprint is kind of a bright spot outlier. So is there a country that's a bright spot outlier? I call them global bright spots. So across the globe, but also globally across all the measures that are bright spots. So that would be a country where it's consistently at the top in terms of the world's metrics and other countries' metrics for economic, environmental, political, and social domains. So in order to make this comparison, first thing you have to do is normalize the scores. So they were all normalized where the country with the least desirable score was assigned to 0, the country with the most desirable score was assigned to 1, and then everybody was mapped onto 0 to 1 linearly based on that normalization. Whether it was a low score is better or a high score is better, the most desirable score was 1 and the least desirable score was 0. And then you can compare across metrics on a similar scale. So it's a pretty simplistic method of doing this, but it does allow comparisons across metrics. Naturally, so if some country was really the best in every single metric, they'd have 1. And if some country was the worst, they'd have a 0 in terms of their average score. And not surprisingly, nobody was 0, nobody was 1. But Iceland was 0.88. And as I kind of mentioned before, that the Scandinavian countries are often, particularly around equity and political, civil liberties, corruption perceptions, they're often scored very high. These are the highest 10, and these are the lowest 10 in terms of this. And 88 is not that far from 1, seems like a pretty good overall score. I'll show another graph in a second. It's a little more complicated than that, which I seem to say a lot. And these are one caveat. All the metrics are not published for all the countries. And this method doesn't work for aggregate numbers like forest loss and total CO2. It's fine for per capita CO2. So those two metrics were excluded, which means this is looking at the remaining 19. And I only looked at countries where at least 15 of those 19 metrics were published. And that ended up being 137 countries. So it's a fairly sizable sample of countries. Top 10 are here, and the lowest 10, in terms of the lowest across the whole set of metrics, are here. It's interesting. This isn't a random set of countries. 9 of them are in Europe, and 1 of them, New Zealand, is in Oceania. There's none in North America, there's none in South America, there's none in Africa, there's none in Asia, none of these top 10. And in the lowest 10, 6 of them are in Africa and 4 of them are in Asia. And none of them are in North America, none of them are in South America. So it's not a random distribution across all these measures who has the highest aggregate metric. The US is at about 0.65. So we're about twice as far from Iceland as Iceland is from Utopia. That's the right way to describe it. And we're a little bit above the overall world score. Where's the world? The world's about a 0.48, which is not surprising. It should be around the middle. The low scores are, as I mentioned, in Asia, less developed parts of Asia, and in a lot of parts of sub-Saharan Africa, as well as other parts of Africa. So one last slide on this global bright spots. So this looks at the data for Iceland and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which are the ends of the scale, right? The highest scoring and the lowest scoring, and then the world, which is in gray. And then across environmental, across social, political, and economic measures, what is the range of normalized scores? So it's probably simplest to look at the political one first, because that's one where it's clear. Across all the political measures, Iceland is significantly displaced, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo is significantly displaced from where the world scores and where Iceland scores. So there's clear separation. So in terms of the political metrics as a domain, Iceland is a global outlier there. Social metrics, also pretty separated, but there's some overlap, and it is much less clear in environmental and economic measures. Iceland benefited from their ancestors landing on an island that's atop the mid-Atlantic ridge, and they have a huge amount of geothermal energy, so they have a very sustainable sources of energy available to them. It's maybe what tipped them to the top of the list in terms of environmental, and their environmental score is pretty high. But the Democratic Republic of the Congo has a pretty low ecological footprint, and that has a lot to do with its degree of development. Similarly, the world has some metrics which, for on average, it has a pretty high environmental score. So there's much less overlap in terms of the environmental score, in terms of the range of the metrics we see for each of these. And a little less overlap, but still a lot of overlap in economics as well. Sometimes it's inequality, sometimes it's poverty levels. Just one comment, Monaco really messes up the GDP per capita for the rest of the world. It's so displaced from everybody that all the bulk of the countries get compressed down in this normalization scheme to a relatively small range. So while it's pretty clear the separation, the distinctions in the political and social domains, just as we saw with the correlation between HDI and ecological footprint, there's connections, there's natural interactions between much of the economic development and environmental sustainability. So wealth can be gained, perhaps at the expense of sustainability or at the expense of equity. And environmental footprints may be low, but that may be at the expense of well-being of the population. So this exercise of looking for, is there a place that we can look at, say they're really environmentally sustainable, equitably prosperous and prosperous economically, socially advanced, and politically free. It's all of those. There isn't quite that place yet. So there's still progress to be made to arrive at a world that really works for everyone. All right, so I'm going to go through a couple quick zoom outs in terms of time in just a couple metrics. First one is population growth. So as I had mentioned, we have been using this as a metric against which to look at rapid change versus not rapid change. And this is the way the population growth rate has changed over the era of the scorecard. So it's declined, it continues to decline, and it's actually declining faster lately than it was before. It's down under 1% now in real time. If we look at going back a few hundred years to 1700, the green area on the graph is what I'm calling the scorecard era. It's the period of time where the scorecard represents the data. You can see that it didn't start going down then. It really peaked in the early 60s. Population growth rate across the world, and it's been going down since then. And in the few hundred years before that, it increased from a pretty low level that's substantially lower than it is now. And if we look at even over a longer period of time, since about the time we shifted to agriculture and started building communities and started this road to our current society, for the vast majority of that time, the rate, as best estimated, was pretty low and stable. It was about 0.02 to 0.04% a year for thousands of years, just until about the middle of the second millennia. You can see it bounces around a little bit in early part of the Common Era, but really starts shooting up in about 1700. And we see population growth as a driver for many metrics. Many argue that to get a handle on all the things we're struggling with, it will take a lot of thought to manage. How do we manage either a flattening or even contraction of the population to come up with a prosperous and sustainable society? Another one to look at that is interesting, atmospheric CO2. So this is not the scorecard measure. So the scorecard measure is how much CO2 are we putting in the atmosphere, either in total or per person. But this is how much CO2, the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. So over the scorecard era, it has gone up, marched up pretty steadily to where it is now around 420 parts per million. If we look at, again, that period from when agriculture kind of started until now, we can see that it was really pretty flat between 250 and 300 until about the end of the 19th century. And then it started rocketing up, and the scorecard era covers kind of the last half of its rise so far. And if you look at it over 800,000 years, you can see, well, it's bounces up and down. Certainly hasn't been above 300 in all that time. This is one of the arguments of the folks that are advocating powerfully for climate restoration, is that there's no experience of human beings being alive in climates driven by atmospheres with more than 300 parts per million of CO2. And in fact, we came around 2/3 of the way through this period. But if you look at the overall planet, we're actually not far from a overall minimum in terms of CO2 concentration. Looking back, farthest I could find really credible estimates of data is about 1.6 billion years ago. CO2 has been declining, particularly as more and more things metabolize it on Earth, like plants and cyanobacteria. And here's fish, reptiles, and mammals being developed. So things look a lot different depending on the time scale at which you look at, whether or not they're things driven by human history or things that are more fundamental to the environment, like CO2. And I think I have just one more graph. So this is the one graph I didn't make that I just thought was interesting. And it shows on a single scale a bunch of things that are tied to a lot of the things that I showed in these graphs: life expectancy, GDP, things like that. There also were two of the metrics that were different than really what we have in the scorecard. One is energy capture, which is the total energy we've extracted from the environment for food, fuel, and raw materials, which is a little bit different than the ecological footprint, but in this case is intended to be sort of a proxy of our productivity, how much we can build houses and make farms and travel around the world and all those kinds of things. And then the second one, which is more peculiar, I thought, was war-making capacity, which apparently is fairly well measured and is used as a proxy for technological capability. Because if we develop a technology, one of the things we can be reliably counted upon to do is to use it to kill other people. So the details of that are not so important. It's just the shape of the graph was very reminiscent, in particular of the CO2 graph I just showed. So you can see that all these things that occurred at the same time as life expectancy went up and prosperity went up and people out of poverty went up were associated with extracting energy and doing things the way we have been doing it resulted in CO2 in the atmosphere rising. And these are very close to the same graphs, this development graph and the CO2 graph. And it's probably the most fundamental thing we've got to figure out how to deal with differently than we've been dealing with it, in my opinion, that we have going on. So, wrap up. So I hope that it's been clear that it's really too complex to responsibly summarize really what's going on. The title of this thing, is it getting better, is it getting worse, is it too close to call, isn't adequate to really describe the complexity of all the different things and how they impact people and how they interact with each other. But nevertheless, here goes. So most things, political's going down a little bit, but poverty's going down a lot, and political was getting better before. And so aside from short-term perturbations and pandemics and things, for the most part, things continue to improve, and not by a little, for the most of humanity. And that's occurring in a very demonstrably unsustainable way. So the things that we measure, the things that we aspire to, that we covet, are becoming more and more available. And that is all occurring in a really egregiously unsustainable way, in my opinion. So that would be my summary of how things are going. So, and the last point would be that if you're up to something, and by up to something, I mean at work on something to make an impact in the world or make a difference with people or take on a project, and please do be up to something, it would be great, go get the data. It is really remarkable to me the way that even just in the last 5 years, the amount of data, the availability of data, the depth, the amount of data on topics is available. Having been collecting this stuff for the scorecard for the last 5 years, tell one story about the Human Development Index and searching for some historical numbers for all countries. And I actually, 4 years ago, found it. The last piece I needed to make the scorecard use all country data for the world. And it was on Desmond Tutu's Google Drive. And he was actually dead at the time, but somehow he had stored a copy of this stuff that the UN had taken down off their website. They didn't have this copy available anymore of the raw data. And he stored it on his Google Drive. And somehow his Google Drive was public. I found it searching and scraped it out of there. And since then, the UN publishes it routinely. They also publish a world measure, which they didn't do until this year. So everything is becoming more available data-wise. So if you're up to something, get the data. And even if you couldn't find it a year ago, you might be able to find it now. We looked for 4 years for inequality data, and the World Inequality Database popped up, and we can pull off all kinds of data. You got to be careful and make sure it's a reputable source, but it's available. And the other experience I have, and I think is broadly, is that, as I wrote it here, from the Hawthorne effect to the measurement problem, which goes from industrial engineering to quantum physics, we consistently see that measurement itself starts to change things. So measuring, paying attention to whether it's from the effect it has on people or the effect it has on the thing, I am a strong advocate that starting to measure is starting to make progress. So that's all I have. Can take questions if there are any questions.
Do we have any questions from anyone?
I guess that shows you said enough. You explained everything so clearly. It's unquestionable.
Thank you, Dave. I know it's an incredible amount of effort and work that you and your team put in to come up with this. Really appreciate you taking the time to share it with us in that level of detail.